Know Thyself is dedicated to the exploration of the most rewarding task an individual can ever embark on, the journey to find oneself. Our intention is to investigate the universal principles that have equipped our species to seek the treasure of all treasures, self-knowledge. With your host, Daniel Powinski and Eduardo Manteca, this is the Know Thyself podcast. Today we're going to be covering occultism, what it is, who is involved, the when, the where, and the why. And, Daniel, I don't know if you want to take it away with what is occultism, first of all.
Yeah. Again, huge question to kind of tackle, and we're really just going to kind of skim the surface on this one and get deeper into more detail as we kind of expand and go through these shows. But really what we're looking at today is just to make some building blocks, some foundational knowledge that we can build off into the future, and really kind of create a common language as we move forward. So when we do say certain topics or certain subjects, we have a shared understanding of what the definition is, so we can kind of build that structure together. So what is occultism? Anytime we're taking a look at a word, the first thing we're going to kind of look at is the definition. And occultism really is just going to mean that which is hidden. So it's kind of the science of hidden forces and the art of subjecting those said forces to the will of the individual. And one aspect that we're going to really look at too, as we kind of start breaking down words, is really almost going beyond the definition. We talked about the analogy of the iceberg. So with the tip of the iceberg, you see the tip of the iceberg, but the main body of that iceberg is actually under the water, and that's where the main mass is. And that's kind of how words are going to react and how you really want to start understanding words. So one thing that we just looked at is the definition of occultism again, which means that which is hidden. But there's a deeper meaning to words that go beyond their definition. So to kind of break that down a little bit more, where we get our words is actually from the Phoenicians. That's why we have phonics. It comes from the Phoenicians. And there was a motto with the wise with the Phoenicians, and it was, if you understood a word just by the definition, you were a deaf Phoenician. Which that means is there's more than just the provided definition of a word if you really want to understand it. So one thing we're really going to look at throughout this podcast is one of the subjects we're going to study is the study of etymology. And what etymology is going to do is it's really just going to look at where does this word come from and the origin of this word, and what does it mean in its root language, and how did they build that word to kind of be played in our language.
Right.
So really, when you look at English is really almost what you would call a bastardized language, because it's a mixture of a bunch of different languages together. Right. And the main components of our language are going to be Latin, Ancient Greek, and Germanic. That's going to be, and then there's going to be a splicing in of a bunch of other different languages that are going to be kind of made up our language. But so one thing we're going to look at when we look at words and we're defining topics and subjects that we cover is we're really going to look into the etymology of the word, because it gives you a much deeper understanding of what that word actually means. So occult and occultism comes from a Latin word called occultare, and that means to hide or conceal. And if you break that down even further, oculus, which is the Latin for the eye. So occultare and oculus really broke down to hide or to conceal from the eye. So occultism really means that which is hidden. So it's really just energy that we cannot perceive with the eyes. And what we're really going to be focusing on there is almost the mental forces that we can't so much perceive with the eyes, but we can actually think and feel about, especially when we kind of expand our sensitivity to actually perceive these events. So what we're really going to kind of work on throughout this podcast is almost de-occulting some of this information. So throughout history, we're always going to go through ages of occulted information and de-occulted information. So once you learn about something, you kind of de-occult it.
Right.
So we've spoken before about things like infrared, microwaves, and even gravity. This is what you would call occulted information, because before we had instruments to actually perceive infrared rays, we didn't know they actually existed. Same with microwaves, right? Now we actually have instruments that can actually measure this, so we've actually de-occulted this information, because now we know that we can't physically perceive it, but we actually know that these forces are actually, and these rays are actually
they do
in our
exist,
environment.
right?
They exist, absolutely. So so really what we're kind of saying is just like what we said, the kind of taking these hidden forces, and how do we subject these hidden forces to the improvement of the individual. So it really kind of comes down to understanding our subconscious and how we can actually utilize our subconscious, because our subconscious is always working. It depends if we're actually having our subconscious work for us or against us. And that's really kind of where these occult principles are going to come into in their application to the self. So that's kind of what we're kind of looking at
With occultism.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, in this line of questions that I'll be asking Daniel, you'll hear me kind of go off a little bit on a tangent, but one of the things that I've always been super curious about occultism, and what the little I know of occultism is who. I know that this is very ancient information, but you talk about the Phoenicians and you talk about ancient Greeks, but let's go all the way back to who really started this at the beginning with occultism, like.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point, because when we look at the who, one thing we're going to kind of cover is, if you would ask, I would say, an individual that's not really studying this subject, if you talk to them about occultism and who's involved, they're usually going to say occultism is an evil thing.
Yeah.
Or kind of like a Satanistic thing. And that's one thing we kind of want to really kind of state in the beginning of this podcast. And that's why we kind of went through the definition as the first thing. Occultism is just a tool. Occultism is just the ability to kind of perceive these forces that we don't perceive with our eyes. But it very much is just a tool. So occultism is going to kind of work like a knife. We talked about it before. So like, say you take that knife and you make me a delicious meal, right? And it's great. But you could also take that knife and stab me in the back when I'm not looking, right? But it's not so much the knife that's good or evil. It was the free will decision that you took to use that knife and the outcome of it, which kind of which would really kind of state whether that was good or evil that you did.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, so occultism is the same way. It's just a tool. Can you use occultism for evil purposes and can control people? Absolutely. You can use it for manipulation. This is what propaganda is. This is what media uses for when they use advertising. These are all occult principles that they're putting into motion to get you to do a certain end.
Right.
Right? They want you to either buy this activity or support this political process. These are all occult forces. But you'd also use these forces for the betterment of yourself. Right? You can utilize these forces to reprogram your subconscious, to build more of a moral standing, to build your character up to become a more higher individual. So it's really this idea of this tool, what you kind of do with this information. So it's really the end justifies the means. So what you do with this is really the difference between, in history or like even in fantasy, it's the difference between an alchemist or a sorcerer, or a white magician from a dark magician. They're using the same tools, but what they're using these tools for are kind of the big difference.
Right.
So when we kind of talk about the who, when you talk about the subconscious manifestation and really how the brain operates, we're really talking about like all the big players in history. And that includes the prophets, the great teachers and leaders, to the worst tyrants we've ever seen. All of these individuals are going to utilize these occult principles in different aspects.
And would you say, with the who, and I know there's a lot of, the list is long, but are some of those individuals even aware that they're using occult principles sometimes? Do you think that they've been taught something to not know it, but they're using it without knowing that they're using those principles? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Some people are going to be what you would call initiated, and they've actually gone through these schools and they've learned these principles from the basics. Some people more people like naturally understand these more than other people. So there's some people who, when we are talking about these podcasts, are going to be like, oh no, I understand that. Like now you're just putting terms to the word.
Right.
For some people, it's going to be brand new information. So really it's going to be kind of a combination of both.
Okay.
So some individuals are going to be aware of it, and some aren't. And a lot of the stuff we're going to cover, you've heard in different terms. So all we're talking about is the root of this information.
Right.
But motivational speakers, all these like business success courses that you'll like see pop up on Instagram,
like 12-step programs,
12-step programs.
Yeah.
All this is esoterically, occultly based. It's just getting new spin and new language, and people are kind of like repackaging this information. And sometimes they're packaging it for certain aspects because they want a certain end and they don't have the whole story. So we might see like bits and pieces of this information kind of scattered in that. So, but when we really talk about the who, like we said, this is the network of these individuals and groups who have embodied this is really the true history of civilization, because these are the power players. You need to know this information if you're going to have any kind of influence on individuals, whether that's good influence or bad influence. So we're going to see this with positive aspects, and we're going to see this with really negative aspects. And we're going to kind of look at both of those examples, kind of see where they break apart. And one of the big reasons why we're going to look into the who, and again, we'll kind of post some information on the website, because there is researchers that have done an amazing job breaking down the who of history and their use of occult or esoteric principles. We'll kind of cover it a little bit in this podcast, but not go into the great detail, but we'll definitely pass on those resources. But one reason we really want to look at the who is there's an occult principle that we're going to talk about called as above, so below. And really what we want to look at is the tyrannical ruler of a civilization very much can be understood by the tyrannical ruler of the self. So as we learn about the outside world, we learn about ourselves, and as we learn about our inside self, we can kind of see
apply it to the outside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when we kind of look at the healing that our civilization needs to do, it's really going to reflect the healing that we personally need to do. And that's really why we started this podcast, Know Thyself, is because we really want to, to change the self, to change the world, you have to change yourself first.
Right.
And that's kind of what we're looking at. We're really trying to look at making sovereign individuals who are all-encompassing, that can move that energy outward. Because I think there's this cry, we see all the problems in this world and everybody wants to fix the world, but we're really looking past the aspect that before we can fix the world, we should really focus on ourselves. And that's really why we're kind of trying to educate or spread this information that has taught us about ourselves and how we can kind of implement it to really kind of betterment our communities and wider ranges.
It's interesting you say that, because the who, I know that, as Daniel said, we'll make sure that we have a more formatted lecture, or maybe bullet points as to where to get these references from those specific who's. But one thing that I like to talk about is the when. The when's my favorite, and the reason the when is my favorite in this case is because it's still relevant right now. It's something that we can apply right now, and it was applied then, and again, it's information that's not new to anybody. That's why you're going to hear a lot of these things that Daniel and I will talk about, and you'll be able to relate to it, from either Greek mythology to the hero story that I know Daniel and I have talked about, and breaking down why those stories are so important, or why they mean something to us even to this day. When children watch movies from like Hercules to anything else, like even like Moana, it's like there's all kinds of principles of good and bad going on simultaneously. So I think the when really is something that's been going on for eternity. I don't know if you can elaborate more on the when with this topic.
You brought up a good point too. One of the things that is really unique when you really start understanding these principles is you go back and you watch these movies of our childhood, and even like watching movies with my nieces and nephews, and it really expands that sensitivity, and you start picking up on themes you never understood about, or you start seeing the holistic connection between the
Right.
themes. We kind of call it the golden thread, and you really start seeing what these stories are trying to tell us. So yeah, great question. When did this knowledge arise? And the truth be told, this is the oldest information in the world. Our logo, as we're looking up on the screen right now, is a sun from a tarot deck from the 16th century. And really what we're kind of trying to show with that sun is an alchemical motto that used to be said that was, there's nothing new under the sun. And that being said, that this information has been known since the beginning of time. And it doesn't matter what time period you're living in, its application and its understanding is very important to you understanding yourself, to you understanding your society, and even your interpersonal connections between people. So these are very, very important, interesting information, and it's just we really can't mark the date of when it started.
Right.
You know, so we know it goes all the way back to Egypt, Babylon, and it's really been weaved all the way through history.
Which is why, to use your word weaved, it's interwoven into religion, right?
Yes.
So a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, you're going to say, well, this is what, I learned, when I was in Catholic school or whatever religion you were raised on. A lot of these principles are very relatable because this information is so ancient. And
yeah, absolutely.
Right?
And it's what makes those sacred books sacred. It's these stories. Even like when we talk about you speaking about mythology, why is mythology so important? It's telling you the story of your consciousness and its evolution through time. And we can relate to these stories because they're the stories of ourselves.
Right.
Right. And then so you were, again, we're going to bring up a lot about movies and pop culture. And we talk about things like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings and like, why was this such an important movie? Why did people get so excited that it became a part of our culture? And it's because it's telling the oldest stories in the world. It's just repackaging them into another applicable way.
Right.
So, we maybe weren't as interested in the story of the sun in Egyptian terms, but that's why they retold them in a sci-fi fantasy way with Star Wars. And it's really just the retelling of the sun god versus Set, which is when the sun sets, and the cycles of the sun god. That's why his name is Luke Skywalker. So because he is actually the sun god in Egypt, which was Horus at the time, they would say would take 12 steps during the day. And that was why his name is Skywalker, because it was like the 12 steps that he took. That's why if you take the word Horus and you actually just switch around the U and the R, you get hours. Because that's the 12 hours of the day. Those were the 12 steps of Horus.
Interesting.
Right. So then Luke takes the 12 steps to face Set, which is Darth Vader. And so it's really just the story of light versus darkness. And
there's those 12 sets you're talking about.
Exactly.
The numerology, I know that you're going to talk a lot about that in this podcast.
Right. Even the 12-step program in AA, the 12-step program of public schools. There's a reason why these numbers are used for completion. 12, 7, 3. We're going to see those kind of come up. And we're going to try to kind of go into detail about its importance, but there's a reason why movies like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings are trilogies. They're told in 3-part segments. So it's just this whole kind of connection of everything. So when, we don't really know. We know that this information goes all the way back to Egypt, and it's been interwoven throughout the history of man. And it's just been what you would really kind of call timeless. But really, right. I love how we always talk about, the thread and how it's kind of been.
Yeah, you talk about that golden thread.
The golden thread, right. So it's the golden thread of history. And as we kind of go further in this, you'll see how this golden thread connects all subjects, not just religious, not just spirituality, not just mythology, but really all the subjects. And we'll kind of go into detail about that.
Right. Now, with that being said, the where. So, would you say? And I don't know if I'm asking the right question here, but my from my understanding, this has been all over the world.
Yes.
This is why this can all be relatable to anyone. Or books like even like, I know The Alchemist has these principles in its book, and I know it's been translated into so many different languages. And one of the reasons being is that everyone can relate to it. You'd think a story like that would be something that, well, maybe the Western world can only relate to, but I know that there's, you know, a whole subculture of people who still feel like that book speaks to them. And so again, my question is, is the where is that, where has this affected?
Yeah, you know, where, and that's a great question there, because we're going to see every culture, every civilization shares these stories. And even before we had trade routes connecting these civilizations, before there was ever communication, they would have the same stories. And that's really, really important to show that these stories, again, aren't an external story. These are an internal story. These what you call come from our subconscious. This is why archetypes, this is why there's certain times, certain symbols that are universal. It doesn't matter if you were living in the North American plains or if you were living in Australia before European settlement. A 5-pointed star meant the same thing. A 6-pointed star meant the same thing, because these are literally symbols that come from our subconscious. So the where is really going to break down the borders, and it's really going to kind of show that the human family is more connected than what we perceive with culture and race, because we do have this connecting thread of our subconscious and the shared subconscious, and that's really where our stories come from. So you really kind of start seeing beyond the expansion of, oh, this is culturally what I am, or this is what my racial identity is, because all these stories are connected. It doesn't matter if you're from Africa, again, South America, you're going to have the same similar stories. So where we see this information is really important too, for the fact that we're going to see this throughout the subjects that we study. So where this information really started to come from in the West is what you would call mystery schools. And those really came out of ancient Egypt, which, if you're actually talking about ancient Egypt, the Egyptians wouldn't call themselves Egyptians. They were called Cometians, because you actually came from Kemet. That's what Egypt was called. Egypt got its name from, I want to say, the ancient Greeks. When they visited it, they called it Egypt. But if you were from Egypt, you would never say you were from Egypt. You were from Kemet. And that literally broke down to the Black Land, because not only was the fertile land near the Nile the most fertile soil that you could grow so much and create a civilization, but this is also where knowledge came from. So they called it the Black Land, because once you start studying this, you see that everything kind of comes from that darkness.
Interesting.
You know, the seed has to give sprout to the plant, to the light. So it's kind of the root of all the information. So that's really why Egypt has this glamour about it, because it's almost like this root of where this information came from, and the surrounding regions like Babylon and everything like that. So one thing is, like, when we talk about the where, it's these mystery schools were where you would almost go to get initiated into this information. So for the majority of history, this information was for a select few of people. So you had your initiates, and they would actually choose individuals who they felt were responsible, educated enough to pass on this information. But this was not just handed out information. This was almost kept for a select few. And this is why in the Bible it talks about milk for children and meat for men. It's not really just talking about like what's served at the dinner table. It's really talking about milk is going to be your kind of your easy information, your 10 Commandments, what we would almost call exoteric religion, and your meat is going to be the inner teachings, and that's like your esoteric teachings. And we'll kind of break down those words a little bit further going in, but really what that means is there's an outer teaching of everything and an inner teaching. And that's really what is going to kind of separate those mystery schools, because the mystery schools were really discussing what is the esoteric teaching. So when we see like Catholic Mass, or we see churches around where we are, or whatever religious situation around, majority of those are going to be exoteric situations.
Yeah, you're just there to do the to follow
not the trend, but you're there on a Sunday to do your mass and then pretty much get out of there because, you know, you got other things to do, and you're not really connecting to what the deeper meaning is.
The deeper meaning, you might be going through the ritual, but you don't understand why you're going through the ritual. Where the esoteric is going to look at, why do you do mass? You know, why are you ingesting the body of Christ? You know, why are you doing all these things? That's where the esoteric is going to come in. Exoteric is going to be, like we just said, the outer teachings. This is going to be for the masses. Esoteric is going to be for the inner teaching. And that was really reserved to a small piece of the population for really a good amount of history. You know, we really do live in a unique time because all this information is available at this point. You know, so there would be, we kind of live in this time that we're so blessed because this information is so available that you actually have to almost ignore this information at this point, where you wouldn't even be almost responsible for this information. Say we lived 400 years ago, because you might not have any access to it. But nowadays, where we live currently, you almost have a responsibility to learn this information, because
nothing's holding you
back. You're not going to get burnt at a stake for learning this information. Right? Where that's why when we talk about alchemy, one of the subjects that we'll talk about, and that kind of helps kind of streamline what we were talking about, the where, like where do we find this information? Alchemy is going to be a whole subject set up to pass on these principles that we're speaking about, but they would almost speak to them in code. So they did not get
prosecuted
or burnt alive, you know. And so again, we kind of have this like false understanding of what alchemy is in our present day understanding, because we were taught that alchemist was, you know, individuals trying to change lead into gold. And really what that was talking about was the lead and the gold of our hearts and our souls. So how do we turn our hearts from lead into hearts of gold? How do we turn our souls of lead into souls of gold? And how do we even turn our minds of lead into minds of gold? And this was the alchemical processes, and this was what they were actually discussing. Very few alchemists actually had interest in creating physical gold. And even if they did, maybe they started that subject to create physical gold. After they would go through this transformation, by the end, they weren't interested in the physical gold, because they knew the mental, the spiritual was far surpassed what any kind of physical gold could ever offer them. So very much when we talk about the where does this come from? Where are we going to find this information? And how does it apply to the subject we're talking about, know thyself, is because alchemy was literally the first self-help program. How do you better yourself? How do you better your character? Again, all those principles we see in these motivational speakers, they're just repackaging this information. But like we said, there's nothing new under the sun. This information isn't new. This is the oldest information we have. So they were fascinated with character and character development. And how do you become the best possible individual?
Which is why we get into the why.
Right, we get into the why.
You know,
exactly.
not to jump into it, but that's another one that, you know, if you're listening, you know, that's why we do this podcast. And Daniel and I have had deep discussions on this particular question, the why. You know, why do we need to better ourselves, or why do we need to go and discuss about the differences between, you know, what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, and how to navigate within, you know, all the noise that's presented to us on a daily basis. And I think that's, to me, why I like to talk about this, or why I like to discuss this with you, because it gives me great comfort, and I hope it does for anybody listening, that people long before us were already talking about this, and we're trying to figure this out, and we're trying to use these principles to be applicable to making yourself a better man, a better person, you know. But yeah, so the why, which is my last question to you, the why. How would you go ahead and discuss the why?
Great question. And why is going to come up again a lot, because why is, when you talk about like the 5 W's, why is where the power lies. And we're going to learn about that when we talk about cause and effect and causality, because why is so important. But why is something you always want to discover. Why am I doing this? Why do I feel this way? Why do I react this way? Why is going to be so crucial to get to the cause rather than living in the effect. And we're going to really break into that, understanding a cause and effect, and how do you get yourself from being a victim of the effect to being somebody who's a perpetrator of the cause and actually directing where that effect is. And that's really the position you want to get into. You want to get to what you would call the chess master, where you're above the board of the chess and you're moving the pieces, rather than being a pawn and you don't even know who's moving you, why you're moving, whether you're in the white square or the black square, right? So why do we learn the occult, which is the subject of this episode? First thing why we learn the occult is these principles are present whether we learn them or not. And that's very, very important. So again, we'll talk about all these principles and we'll kind of break them down one by one. But a good example of this is the example of gravity. So gravity does not care whether you understand it or even believe in it. Gravity is just going to react, right? It's an input-output situation. So you input this information, you get this output every time. So even if I was unaware of what gravity was, let's say, and I just never understood the subject, and I tried to walk out the window right now, I'm going to fall right to the ground. It doesn't matter whether I believed in gravity or if I did not believe in gravity. Gravity's still going to have an effect on me. And it's always going to have the same effect. It doesn't matter if we walked out this window 200 times, 400 times, I'm always just going to fall straight down. So how these occult principles work is they don't care. They're almost emotionless. There's no emotion in this aspect. It's almost the mechanical workings of the universe. It's almost like the clockwork. It doesn't matter if you understand it or not. It's still going to have an effect. So these occult principles are either going to affect you positively or negatively, and they really don't have any emotion whether you understand them or not. And really, when we start talking about the people that do understand this, they're in a power position because you don't understand them, and they have that sway over you.
Right. Well, they're avoiding falling out of a window, you know,
exactly,
more often than the person who decided to not educate themselves.
Right. And they're maybe motivating people to fall out.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so that's really a kind of one thing that we really want to do. So one thing we want to kind of cover is your belief in occultism, again, does not matter. These principles are going to be at play. It's just whether you learn about them, become sensitive to them and aware of them, that you can start utilizing them to avoid self-inflicted pain, which is something that we all do. So why we want to learn this information? Well, it's because we want to better ourselves and utilize this information. And this information is so important in the study of ourself that we really can't really break down the self fully until we understand these principles and start applying them to our lives.
Oh, very well said. Yeah, and again, I know that I'll reiterate this over and over, but Daniel and I are just, we're close friends that decided to really just bring this to light, and to bring this to an audience, to just hopefully explain these things with regards to the why,
Right.
We can talk about philosophy, we can talk about history all day long, and I know, Dan, you're really good at sort of breaking down a lot of these historical chapters in human existence, but they don't matter unless we know how to really use them and why to use them. And I think in this time that we're living in right now of uncertainty, people want to lean onto something that gives them direction, and we hope that that's what we're doing.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a good way to put it. There's so much good research out there about, what these principles are, who were the people that invented these principles, or who were the organizations that passed these principles down and their effect on society. So many different ideologies and great information out there. And you're right. Really what we're looking to do is just kind of put this in an applicable application for the individual to use, with the main interest of self-discovery and really understanding the self and kind of starting that journey. So I think that's a really important thing to put into motion, that we're really, again, none of this information, most of this information is not ours. All we are doing is retelling this information and the strategies that we've used to apply it to our lives.
Correct. For a lot of people out there, Daniel and I were talking about what's to come and the things that we'll make that are relatable. But as you hear or listen to the podcast, you'll start to see a lot of patterns that we're talking about right now. I know we're starting off very broad, but over the course of this podcast, we'll make sure to condense a lot of this information and also find a way to keep it on a relatable track, I guess I should say. We have multiple episodes we're going to be putting together, and I think it was important to really go into what occultism is in the first place. So
yeah, even just to kind of see the strategies that we're going to be looking at as we come up with new topics to discuss on, breaking down words, understanding the roots of them. This is all going to be a process that the individual should take into their own life, because we'll start to see, really, again, like I say, we've said this so many times, but you're expanding that sensitivity so you can perceive this information, because really this is a classroom for the development of yourself. That's what this whole 5 sense situation is. This is a construct of reality. The construct of reality is for you to almost understand yourself and build your character and develop your soul. And so all we are trying to do is just say that, kind of explain the tools that we've used that have had positive application. And really kind of one thing we really want to stress is knowing yourself to utilize these principles to the highest good. We're going to talk about the will in further episodes, and really what does that will entail, and how do you separate maybe your selfish will from the higher will, and why that's so important to not only ourselves and the development of the self, but also the development of a more peaceful, loving society that we all kind of envision and would love to see manifest around us. But how do we get there?
How do we do that?
And really, I think the understanding of yourself is the first step into building that, which we really want to see manifest for us.
Oh, well said. And that is why it's called the Know Thyself podcast.
Know Thyself podcast.
So I know we covered a lot today, but the next few episodes, as I mentioned, we'll have more condensed material, I should say. Not condensed, but sort of more specific.
Yeah, I would say we're not going to cover as much as quickly. We just really kind of went through the whole... The idea that we broke down what is occultism in such a short level, we could go on episodes and episodes about that. The where, and the what, the when, and the why. So this was really just kind of like a breeze through operation, but we really are going to look to focus in and really get the details of this information. So next week we should be a little bit more condensed and kind of build off that. But the idea being that these are all building blocks to kind of build the foundation, and then hopefully we can construct something all together.
Oh, well said. Awesome. Well, thanks for listening. We'll make sure to be able to answer all your questions as time goes on and this podcast develops. We'll be able to have a blog and also the website to take any suggestions. We'd love to hear from you and see if we can need to talk or speak a little more about certain topics that maybe we rushed through or might have rushed through. There's no real agenda here other than just trying to help you out. So we appreciate you engaging and listening, and we look forward to the next lesson.
Until next time.
Until next time.